So good morning and welcome to the next episode of CommsCamp, which today is going to be all about working with stakeholders. So as you'll see, we are just over halfway through our series, the initial run of CommsCamp, which is focusing in on the 10 areas that Muckle Media uses when creating a strategic comms plan. So we've worked our way already through insights, strategy, reputation, planning, and capacity. And I think stakeholders fits in really nicely as the next stage, because once we understand the insights and we've got the golden egg opportunity and we've created a strategy around that, we've probably already started thinking about stakeholders, because if we're seeking to influence things and to reach, the right audience with the right message, then stakeholders is integral to being able to do that. So what we're going to be talking about today really is some quite straightforward, simple tools that you can use straight away in your organization. And they may be familiar to some people already as well. So some simple tools that you can use in order to be able to really identify and hone in on who your key stakeholders are and how you reach them. So as a starting point, if we have a look at the questionnaire that we use as our capability review, you've got 5 questions here relating to stakeholders. The most simple, straightforward one is, do you know who your key stakeholders are? And I think this is not something you do once and you file away or you don't change. Stakeholders are constantly evolving. Obviously, there's like really key times that your stakeholders might have quite a drastic change, such as if there's a general election, you may suddenly find that core set of political stakeholders that unfortunately you might have built a really good relationship with suddenly, particularly with the way things have changed so much in the last few years, where there have been some quite surprising changes, particularly in Scotland. So things like political change stakeholders can change quickly and swiftly, and effectively overnight. You need to sort of get on side with a whole new set of stakeholders sometimes when there's big political changes. Having an engagement plan. So if you already know who your stakeholders are, have you got named relationship owners? Is there somebody in your organization that is the right person to have that relationship and to be able to build the relationship? Media relations. So we're not going to talk about media relations in depth today in the kind of core content, but instead really excited to have a fantastic journalist joining us, who's being interviewed by my colleague Rosie, who's one of the directors here at Muckle. So she's speaking to Jane from the Scotsman. Influencers, I think that could be a whole load of separate sessions as well. So I think for today we're gonna concentrate more on stakeholders as a group, and we're not going to go into the specifics of every single individual type of stakeholder. But increasingly, digital influencers are becoming so important for many different types of brand. And then just having a program in place. So I think this can tie back to the previous session that we did on planning and really understanding who you're reaching and how often and in what way. So to get you started, here are some of the different stakeholder groups that you might have in your organisation. Now, these don't always apply to everybody, and I also think depending what you do and who you do it for, there's definitely going to be other types of stakeholders that aren't on this list already. But it gives you some really useful, what we would call buckets that you can put your stakeholders into. So as a starting point, you've got suppliers. Now, suppliers, obviously, you're their client, their customer, so you have sort of a relationship with them from that perspective. But also, depending on the business you're in, your suppliers could be incredibly critical. If you require them to give you something by a certain time so that you can meet your obligations, then having that great stakeholder management with your suppliers is incredibly important. So I find sometimes suppliers can be the forgotten stakeholder, and it's when things go wrong or you need to call in a favor that actually having really fantastic supplier relationships can be a real sort of bonus. And within your industry, so to give you an example of ourselves, we work in the PR industry. So, you know, on the first level, we've got some PR industry organizations. So things like the Chartered Institute of PR, you've got the PRCA, and then you can go out a level and start to think about the marketing mix. So we're members of maybe the Marketing Society. And then you've got the sort of wider business kind of industry group as well. So that's everything from chambers of commerce and institute of directors. You might then have investors. So again, if you've got some big radical plans that you want to push through, and maybe the investors need to buy into this and sign it off in a board meeting, or maybe they're gonna vote on something. Obviously important to manage those investors. And then obviously an entire separate stream of activity for bigger organizations is investor relations. So how do you manage, you know, communication around things like corporate earnings announcements? Depending on your industry, you may have regulators. And obviously at the moment with the COVID situation, I think, you know, everything's regulated almost. So no matter what kind of business you're running, you are needing in some way to, you know, feed into guidelines that are coming out maybe from the government. But equally, if you are building something somewhere, you're going to have to think about all the regulations in terms of planning permissions, maybe any environmental regulators that might want to have some sort of interest in your project. So when it comes to building in particular, I think stakeholder management is incredibly critical. You then have communities, and I think community is such a fantastic word, and it's really all encompassing, isn't it? So if you run a local business somewhere, you've got a fantastic community within that local area. But increasingly with digital and also the way that things are being delivered slightly differently at the moment, I think communities can really come into their own just now in terms of building an online community that's more than that, that's really, you know, that group of people that maybe are passionate about your cause or your brand. So if you can get community right and put community at the center of what you do, if that's the right strategy for you, that can be a really good opportunity, and obviously feeds into stakeholders as well. Trade unions, so particularly if you're in a unionized organization, getting the trade union on side and getting their buy-in and really consulting with them on any big changes you might be making is obviously critical. Lots of different strategies that you can use to get your trade union reps on side. And again, that could be a whole nother kind of masterclass session around how to engage with a trade union. And again, another sometimes forgotten influence stakeholder group is your employees. So I really enjoyed what Caroline Fisher from ASICS EMEA was saying about their purpose, and the way that actually, you know, you really need to get your purpose right internally with your team, and you need to live and you need to breathe it. And then once you've done that, you can take it externally. So I think whatever your strategy is and whatever comms plans you have, if you can start with your team and work outwards, that's always going to be the best route to success. You've then got your government and your political stakeholders. So there's loads of different levels you can look at that. Maybe just at a very localized level, you'll have things like county councillors, you'll have your local councils, local authority areas, and different stakeholders within that. You've then got your members of parliament at Westminster. In Scotland, you have members of the Scottish Parliament as well. And then there's a whole load of other different types of political influencer you might want to engage with. As an example, maybe there's a cross-party group that's really relevant to your organisation, and maybe you're lobbying them to improve some form of legislation that's going to make it easier for you to achieve your organizational objectives? And if so, then you probably want to look at that cross-party group and identify who's on it and who might be able to help you. Equally with committees in both Westminster and in Holyrood. And while it's not straightforward, I think there is a real wealth of information available online that you can tap into if you want to explore that further. And we'd be happy to signpost some of that to you if you wanted to post about it into the CommsCamp Facebook group. Critical, obviously, is your customers, or if you're not a commercial organisation, maybe it's your patients or it's your users that maybe engage with your service. So getting them into the mix, and this is not a prioritised list. I would say this really, actually, although I've provided a list here, I think it, much like our wheel, it's circular. And depending on what stage you're at within any projects that you're working on, what you will find over the lifespan of your organisation is different stakeholders will become more prominent at different times. So there may be a point when you are really lobbying hard with government in order to get a critical change made, and that might make them just so much more important for a time frame while you work on that campaign. So customers we've mentioned, and then one of our favorite types of stakeholder obviously is media. And again, I think throughout this entire series, we've been talking about media relations almost within every element. But communications and PR is about so much more than just media. So really pleased that later on we're speaking to Jane, and she'll be giving us some insights into how she likes to be engaged with as a stakeholder and as a route into many other stakeholders. So sometimes, the strategy is to use the media in order to maybe lobby or to reach some of the other audiences. And influencers, as I mentioned. So we're not just talking about your sort of Love Island winners who can pose on the beach holding a product. I think there's been some really interesting and slightly controversial influencer activity coming out of the government throughout the communication of COVID. So that's a really good case study to look at. If you think influencers, they're all about selling fake tan, they're definitely not. There's so much that you can do if you can get the right influencers on board. And then others, so that's really broad, and it's really going to come down to your organisation and identifying what gaps there might be, who cares really about your cause, your purpose, or your organisation. So that's a really good starting point to have. And within this week's workbook, we've got all of these categories, including the other one, along the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, we've got some space there. So what I would recommend as phase one is if you write into that box, the broad groups. So if we're looking at customers, you might want to start saying there, okay, well, we've got our B2B customers, we've got our UK domestic customers, and then we've got our export market, which is reached through distributors, let's say. So you can keep it quite broad. And then as a stage two, and there's different ways of managing this within your organisation. As a stage two, I would work towards, if you can, and if it's appropriate, potentially having that named list that really goes into the details of everybody. And further into CommsCamp, we're going to be talking about crisis. Now, crisis is a point when having really good work in hand on stakeholder mapping, analysis, and management can really help you if you do unfortunately have a crisis situation. If you have databases and details to hand of every single person that's a stakeholder for your organization, then if there is a crisis, and equally when you're having the good times, if you're launching something, if you're looking for support for something, if you have a clear plan in place around who the stakeholders are, right down to their names and their contact details, and then who's going to reach out to them with the good and the bad and anything in between, is really helping you to be in a good starting point. So whilst crisis is going to be a completely different topic that we're going to cover in depth, I would say consider crisis and consider the good times when you look at stakeholder relations. So probably a lot of you have seen this before, but I think you can't talk about stakeholders without discussing power and interest. And it does have different names. People use different phrases to talk about this grid, but we talk about power along the left-hand side, and then we have interest along the bottom. And again, you can rename these to suit you depending on your project or your strategy and where this might fit into, making it workable for your organization. But we've given it sort of 4 areas that are quite commonly used within the industry. So if we start bottom left, what we're looking at here is any stakeholders that aren't particularly powerful, and sometimes you might find when you group some not very powerful people together, they become powerful. So we talk about having a dynamic stakeholder map as well, where it effectively may change over different stages of a project or different phases of, development within your organization. So the monitor section is people who are not particularly interested and they're not particularly powerful. And generally as well, I would say this is generally probably going to be a confidential document that's password protected, and it's managed within a relatively tight group of people. Because what you don't want to do is upset anybody, because you've published your stakeholder grid on your website, and somebody's a bit upset that they're seen as being not powerful or interested. So in that monitor section, what we're going to put there is people who are less powerful, less interested, and what we're saying in terms of our strategy with them is, we're just going to monitor them. So if they come to us, if they want something, that's fine, but we are not seeing them as, being really, really key to how we're going to move forwards. So that would be the monitor section. You've then got the powerful, but maybe not very interested section. So depending on the stage that your project or whatever the plan is that requires this detailed stakeholder mapping is at, sometimes you might find political stakeholders going in there, for example. So it depends, how close we are to an election. It also depends, if it's within their what they see as being their kind of portfolio. Other people you might put in there, it could be certain journalists, you would love them to be a bit more interested, but they're not. So they're powerful, but they're not sort of knocking on your door looking to write about it every week. And then depending on the project, there's loads of things that could go in there as well. So power high, interest is low. And then down on the bottom right-hand side, we have this keep informed group. So these are the people who are interested in your project, and however, they're probably not hugely powerful. So you might not necessarily want to directly consult with them and take them every step along the way with you, but you do need to keep them informed. And what you find is that particularly when it comes to detractors, if you have somebody here in the keep informed group and you don't satisfy those needs, then you can find them quite quickly moving up into the, maybe grouping together and becoming more powerful and starting to cause you problems. So we would say that would be the informed group. And then the biggest trick to this document is making sure that you don't just stick everybody up into the top right-hand corner, because going back to this list of different types of stakeholders, I think there is quite an easy starting point, which is to say, well, everybody on that list is very powerful and very interested. So there's a little bit of work usually to be done on this, where you start off with everybody in the top right, and then you get a bit critical and you start to move people either to the left or down the way, or diagonally as well. So the power and interest grid is a really good starting point. As I say, again, it's not a static document, and having a dynamic power and interest grid that changes as a project evolves is definitely something that we would recommend doing. So that then takes you on to this management plan. And what we're giving you today is really very much a simplified version of the types of tools that we use in a very complex stakeholder management situation. But hopefully it will just give you a starting point, and then you can build that out further based upon the needs of your organization. So over on the left, we've got this idea of an owner. So you may find that you have yourself, maybe you're in the comms team, maybe you're heading up marketing or communications. So it might make sense that you're going to manage the relationships with the media stakeholders. So you drop media in here. And again, in terms of channels, so we're not putting media there as the channel. That would maybe be having a press release pipeline, having, a series of one-to-one briefings. It might be some off the record discussions. It could be some form of newsletter. It could be fam trips. It could be getting them on site to see, where you're going to be building something new and exciting. And then in terms of frequency, this can be a range. So it could be, as required. To give you another example, you might decide that for the political stakeholders, the CEO is the best person to be making that communication. So you could pop the CEO's name in here. You could say this is, tier one political stakeholders, which is the MPs and the MSPs relevant to your organization, your locations, and so on. And then you might say, okay, well, he's going to do a quarterly coffee meeting with each of them if he possibly can, and get them on site. And then you might also want to simultaneously run a quarterly email newsletter that's just going to update them on the current status of your projects and the priorities for your organization, and maybe have some calls to action in there as well around how they can engage with you and how you can help them as well, because it's always going to be a two-way relationship. So that would be your stakeholder management system. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move over to my colleague Rosie, and I'm really excited this morning to have Jane Bradley, who's the Consumer Affairs correspondent for the Scotsman. Obviously, the Scotsman covers Scotland on Sunday as well, so she has two quite different roles there. And I'm going to hand over now, and she will pick that up with Rosie.
Hi there, we've got Jane Bradley with us today, who's been a journalist for many years. She's a reporter and consumer affairs correspondent for the Scotsman and Scotland on Sunday. And Jane's going to give us some tips today about how to pitch to journalists and what to do, and more importantly, what not to do, and just a bit about her job and some of the challenges in journalism these days. So Jane, thanks for your time today.
No problem.
We'll just kick off with some questions on how you got into journalism. How did you get involved in journalism career in the first place?
In the first place, it was a very long time ago. I did work experience at the Northern Echo in Darlington when I was 15, and basically went on after that, went back every holidays, did work experience, did paid shifts, did a lot of work experience over the summers at university where I was studying in Scotland. So I ended up doing some work experience at the Scotsman and the Evening News, and then got a job on the Evening News after I did my journalism postgrad at Cardiff University.
Okay, and has the role changed quite a lot in that time, and the sort of journalism career changed a lot in that time, obviously with social media taking off and pressures on all types of media with cutbacks and challenges from other areas? So how's it changed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been in lots of different roles, lots of different types of news, lots of different sort of departments. But I suppose the main thing, obviously, is the internet. When I started 15 years ago at the Evening News, we did have an online presence, but it wasn't a big thing. We weren't sort of reporting straight online, that kind of thing. And then I moved into business journalism and went to the Scotsman. And even then, things were going online, but it was more the paper going online rather than the other way around. After that, I was at the Sunday Times for a little while in the business section there. And, again, things were online, but it was not part of my job. I didn't have to think about putting things on the web. So it's really only been sort of the last 10 years things have progressed that, we do think more about writing for online. And then obviously everything, things go in the paper as well. But, we're thinking about our online audience as much as we're thinking about our print audience.
Mm-hmm. And how's that created new pressures and challenges for you and for your colleagues?
Well, I suppose when I first started out in journalism, it was literally writing the stories. That was my job. I had to find and write the stories. things have changed as time's gone on. You know, it started that I'd potentially have to write a headline for a story. But now, you know, I have to upload every story myself to the website, and that includes picture captions, headlines, subheads. I have to make sure I've got pictures myself. We still have a picture desk, but, you know, a lot of the time I have to make sure that, you know, if it's a company that's sending me something, I have to make sure they're sending me pictures to go with it, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of extra bits and pieces that go with it rather than just actually writing the words now.
So what would you say you enjoy most about your job now, and maybe least about it as well?
I absolutely love my job. I've always loved my job. There is, you know, nothing better than basically being paid to be nosy for a living, which is what you are if you're a journalist. So I suppose that's the main thing, just getting to find out about interesting things, speaking to interesting people every day. In terms of enjoy least, I suppose it is the sort of fiddly admin, you know, uploading things to the web, having to click boxes to make sure something's a web image, having to make sure there's a subtitle on that or a, you know, picture caption on this. You know, it's not that that stuff's absolutely awful, but it sort of takes away from the main part of my job that I enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And what do you focus on in your role? Obviously, you do consumer affairs and general news. So tell us a bit more about maybe your average day, if there is such a thing, and what areas you concentrate on.
I mean, I am consumer affairs correspondent, so I would say sort of 80% of what I do is consumer news, which is, I sort of like to describe that as kind of business for normal people. So I don't write for the business section. I used to in the past. I have been a business reporter and a business editor, but now I write consumer news that normal people would be interested in. So I'm not writing the kind of business to business stuff, but I'm writing, you know, if it's about Tesco's, it might go to me because it's something that everybody, you know, everybody shops at Tesco's, everybody's interested if Tesco's is, you know, getting big profits or small profits or whatever. Whereas if it's a smaller company, you know, that might be in the business section. I also do quite a lot of general news. I suppose I'm sort of an experienced reporter. I end up doing quite a lot of foreign news, things like that. So I've been working on the American election quite a bit recently. And there's various other sort of topics which are, you know, my sort of pet topics that I've sort of adopted over the years. But yeah, most of my time is spent on consumer news.
And what do you look for in a story, and what type of stories do you enjoy? If a PR is approaching with a story, what kind of thing grabs your interest?
I think it's got to have a really good hook. Something's got to be new. It's got to have some new stats, something like that. I think some of the, you know, most PR agencies do a great job. There's the odd time you get something that is more of a, it's more of a something that they think is interesting because the company has done it, but it's not got a hook. It's not got something new. It's not got something interesting that's happening. They just tell me, you know, this company's interesting because it's manufacturing X. And it's like, well, when did it start manufacturing X? Or, you know, 4 years ago. So, you know, there's nothing new to hook the story on. There's got to be something interesting happening at the moment.
Okay. And then do you always prefer an exclusive story, or does that not make a big difference to you?
An exclusive story is always absolutely welcome. As you mentioned, as well as writing for the Scotsman, I write for Scotland on Sunday. And all of the stuff in Scotland on Sunday has to be exclusive. So every week I'm looking for things for Scotland on Sunday. So if there's something that fits that brief, that's, you know, that's absolutely great.
And what tips do you give to PRs pitching a story for you for the Scotsman and for Scotland on Sunday?
If it's for Scotland on Sunday, obviously try and make sure that you can tell me about it as early in the week as possible. We have our first conference for Scotland on Sunday on a Wednesday afternoon. So if I can pitch a story at that point, that's great. That's not to say that things that come in later in the week won't make it. You know, obviously if it's a good story, it will. But if I can pitch it early, it's going to get, you know, more likely to get a good slot in the paper. The opposite is true if it's something for the Scotsman. I don't want an embargoed press release sent out 4 days in advance because it will get buried. I literally get probably 700 emails a day, and that's not an exaggeration. So, you know, if you send me something on a Monday that's embargoed for Friday, the chances are by Thursday it will have got absolutely lost and buried, you know, and unless there's something absolutely stand out about it, I won't remember. So, you know, to send it to me the day before under embargo is fine, but don't think you're being helpful by sending it out days and days in advance.
That's quite interesting. I think a lot of PR people and their clients think it's best to get in there early, say a few days in advance, and then maybe follow up. So you'd recommend against that?
Yeah, I mean, if you do a follow-up the day in advance, then fine. But I would say it's probably not that useful to have the early one. I'd prefer the follow-up one the day before. Just because we don't generally, for the daily paper, plan that far in advance. As I say, if it's something embargoed to Sunday, if it's an exclusive, that's different. But if it's something for the daily paper, you know, we are working very much on a day-to-day basis because we don't know what's going to happen. So, you know, I can't plan that I'm definitely going to be able to get you know, a scheduled story in on Thursday when, you know, there might be another lockdown on Thursday and 3/4 of the paper's taken out with that. You know, we just don't know what's actually going to happen in the news. So.
And do you like it when a PR follows up and emails and phones you, or would you rather just left you to read the press release in your own time and get back to them if you've got questions with it?
I think it depends. I mean, as I say, the volume of emails I get, if every PR who sent me a press release followed up with a phone call, I would literally never get time to write a story. So please, no. If there's a reason for the phone call, you know, if there's something that you want to discuss that you maybe don't want to put down, you know, some background off the record, something like that, absolutely fine. The kind of, to be honest, generally London PR agencies that have done a survey on something or other that I'm probably, to be honest, not going to be able to get in, phoning up and telling me that they've sent me an email, yeah, it's more of an annoyance than anything else, though I do understand why they have to do it.
Fair enough, good advice. And what's the best time to get in touch? So you obviously for Scotland Sunday you've said earlier in the week because you plan quite far ahead, but if a story for the following day, best to get in touch perhaps before 10 o'clock in the day, would that be your advice?
Yeah, if it's a story for the following day, our first conference in the morning, well, our deadline for getting stories in is 10 o'clock. So yeah, if you can send something out first thing in the morning, that's ideal.
And would you always recommend against sending something out sort of afternoon, after lunch? There's just no point unless it's a very big story that's just breaking.
Yeah, if it's a very big story that's just breaking, obviously, yes. But if it's kind of a scheduled sort of press release that you've been sitting on and think, oh, you know, when should I send it out? Yeah, mornings are much better for that, unless there's a reason for it. You know, if you have to send it out in the afternoon, you have to send it out.
Sorry. And what about pictures? You mentioned you also have to source your own pictures now quite often. So would a good image really make a story? And if you get a story without any image or with an image that isn't very attention grabbing, would that put you off covering it?
What, if it had an image with it, you mean?
If it has a good image with it, would that sort of lean towards giving it more coverage than if it didn't have an image with it, or had a kind of very poor image with it?
It would lean me towards giving it more coverage. No, it very much depends on the story, but if it's got a good image with it, then that saves me a job essentially, and it saves the picture desk a job. So yeah, you know, if you have good images with the story, send them over with the, you know, with the press release. That's obviously very helpful, and you know, saves us having to chase up another image for it.
And how do you prefer to be contacted? Is email better, or would you rather somebody give you a quick call to see if you're interested? What works better for you generally?
An email is definitely better because, you know, as I say, there's a lot of stories coming in every day. If every single one of them was a phone call, that would be difficult. If it's something very specific, a very, very good story, something that, as I say, you want to discuss more as background or something before you send over, you know, the sort of formal lines that the company you're working for wants to send over, then yeah, you know, feel free to give a call. I'm not opposed to people giving me a ring, but in terms of just sending over a kind of bog standard release, yeah, it's better by email.
And what about off the record? If somebody wants to brief you off the record, would you advise them to that? Because I know some people are quite wary about going down that route. How do you see it?
No, absolutely. I mean, it depends how and why. So, I mean, if you're going to give me something that I'm not going to be able to cover because it hasn't got a hook at all, and then you phone me up and tell me, well, off the record, actually, the background of this story is this, but you can't cover it, then that's not going to make me able to cover the story because, you know, if there's nothing to add to it. But if you want to give me a bit of a steer on something, say I've contacted you about a story about your company rather than you sending out, you know, a proactive press release. Say I've contacted you about something and, you know, you're only going to be able to send me a set, you know, sort of formal line on it because that's what you decide is the best thing for the company to say in public, but you want to give me a background briefing on what the actual situation is, then that's fine. You know, it's better to have that information than not have it, and we can kind of discuss, you know, what you're happy to be put in the story or not.
Okay. And what if somebody wants to pitch a client for an interview piece or a feature? Have you got much space for that in Scotsman or Scotland Sunday? And how far in advance should we be thinking about that? And what would interest you in covering that individual or that feature?
For me, that's not really part of my job. I can't really do interview pieces. That's not to say we don't do them. We do. The business desk do quite a lot of that kind of stuff, but it would be my colleagues on the business desk to speak to you about that rather than me.
Okay. And what would put you off covering a story, or what are your pet hates when it comes to PR?
Something that isn't a story. I mean, I think anyone who works in news, whether on this side of it or in PR, and obviously a lot of people have done both, know what is a good story, and you know in your gut what's a good story. And I think probably as a PR, when you're sending something out, you know whether it's something that actually is a story or whether it's a bit of a puff piece for the company. And, you know, if it's a puff piece, which, you know, basically just promoting something that isn't really intrinsically interesting in itself, it's not going to make it to the paper. If it hasn't got that gut wrench of an actual story, then it's just not going to make it.
And how has the pandemic affected your job? Obviously, you can't go out and meet people, but any other ways it affected you? Has it made it harder to plan ahead or decide what have space for other stories that aren't pandemic related? What has the impact been?
I think the problem is it feels like every story is pandemic related at the moment. So even if it is, a consumer story about, retail figures or about trends of what people are, spending their money on, that kind of thing, it's all related to the pandemic. So it's all, shops are struggling because people are not going to high streets. It's all people are spending money on new pajamas rather than workwear, all that kind of thing. So everything is pandemic related, and that's, I suppose in a way people are getting pandemic fatigue to a certain extent. So trying to find stories that are not related to it would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
in terms of my actual job, it doesn't. Sorry.
There you go. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of actually doing my actual job, apart from the fact I can't meet people face to face, it doesn't really affect me too much. A lot of the time I'm speaking to people on the phone anyway, speaking by email. We're all still working from home at the moment, or most of us are. So, but that doesn't make too much of a difference.
Okay, and looking ahead when people can get out and about again, hopefully sometime in the not too distant future, do journalists like yourself have time now to meet somebody for a coffee if there isn't a definite story related, or have lunch with someone, or sit down for a briefing with someone, or just a chat? Or is it best just to stick to phone and email and try and get people in that way to cover your stories?
I think it depends. I mean, I think it's really important to meet people and, and sort of form a relationship with them. But also it's quite difficult to get the time out of the office. So ideally, to meet someone who also, as part of a sort of relationship building exercise, but also if they happen to have a story for me for that weekend, that makes it easier to justify the time out of the office on that particular week. So yeah, I would say, it's great to meet people. I really like doing that. I think it is important, but if they can come with something concrete as well, that means, I've got a good story in the bag for that week, then that really helps.
Okay. And finally, anything else you'd like to share? Any tips you'd like to give us? Any final words of wisdom?
I'm not sure I have any words of wisdom. Just what I said before, really, in that, as a public relations professional, what is a good story, and in your gut that if something isn't a good story, we're not going to run it, no matter, how well you pitch something, or how well the journalist that you're pitching to. If the story isn't there, we're not going to be able to run it. So I suppose it's difficult when you've got a relationship with a company and you've got to sort of prove something to them. But, I think you need to go with your gut and, say to them, if something is not a story, you've got to tell the company you're working for, I can't pitch this. This is not a story. Sort of wasting your time, and a journalist's time pitching something that's just not going to work is no good for anyone, really.
Okay. Thanks, Jane. That's been really helpful. Thanks for your time today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rosie, and big thank you as well to Jane. I thought that was absolutely fascinating and really good to hear from Jane about the challenges that she faces as a journalist and the different ways that we can engage with her, whether that's deciding whether we want to put the phone call in or send her an email, and also some good pointers there around the differing needs of the Scotsman versus Scotland on Sunday. So a great point made around particular interest in exclusives. I think every journalist you speak to, they always want an exclusive. So something that we can absolutely be using as a good tool when we have a story that we think suits that exclusive sort of storyline. And that's us really for this week. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully you found today useful and interesting. And what I would encourage you to do, particularly, I know some people are joining us throughout the programme that weren't with us right from the beginning. So for anybody in that situation, all the content we've created so far is on our Facebook group. It's on the Facebook Muckle Media page. And if you go into videos, you'll be able to find that and play it back right from the beginning, all the way back to our insights session. And additionally, over on our blog, and we can email this to anybody that needs it as well. So if you ever want to get in touch with us, you can email us at hello@mucklemedia.co.uk, or events@mccallmedia.co.uk, and we'll be able to come back to you. But we do have these worksheets as well. So the worksheets, the first few pages is the capability review, and then the second section is tailored to each of the steps. And we have some activities in there that you could have a look at specific to stakeholders for this week. So if you don't have those already, then please do download them. And equally, as we've said all the way through, you know, send us your feedback, tell us what you're looking for, and definitely engage on the group as well, which is called CommsCamp, and that's on Facebook. But I'm going to leave it there and really look forward to seeing people next week for our next